Hello and welcome to Evolution of the Mammals. And let's go ahead and get this show on the road. Let's start off with where to find mammals in the evolutionary tree and what they are. So, mammals obviously are a lobe-finned fish. Come back here. So, this is true because you have lobed fins being the shared derived characteristic that separates all of the other fish and more basal animals from the rest of them. So, I think that's pretty much it. Mammals are lobe-finned fish. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say there. Mammals are part of the only two clades that have amniotic membranes associated with embryonic development. Reptilia, which includes the lepidosaurs, the turtles, the tuataras, and the archosaurs, crocodiles, and the only other extant archosaur is dinosaurs, of course, theropod birds. So, mammals are amniotes. What else makes a mammal? Amazingly enough, hair. Indeed, hair and milk are two of our big features that we put down to separate mammalia out from the other amniotes. Now, what else? Well, all mammals, except for a select few exceptions, are endothermic. There's only one mammal that I am personally aware of that is not. That's the naked mole rat, and it lives in burrows deep enough that regardless of what season it is, the temperature never changes. So they're just the temperature of their burrow. Then we also have the four-chambered heart. That's a pretty big deal. This endothermy and a four-chambered heart are features of mammals, but they are not features only found in mammals, because dinosaurs also feature these two features. Crocodilians also have a four-chambered heart. So, mammals, when it comes to respiratory muscles, they have lungs with a diaphragm. Not all respiratory muscles are the diaphragm, the muscle in the bottom of the chest cavity that when it constricts, it drops down and the lungs expand, and when it contracts, or when it relaxes, it pushes up and the lungs shrink. Right? This kind of breathing is unique to organisms with a diaphragm. All mammals have a diaphragm. My geckos do not have a diaphragm. They have a box lung. That's not going to get you tested on, but the muscles of the box lung are connected to the muscles of the legs. And so, in order to breathe, in order to expand and contract their lungs, they actually have to use their arms and leg muscles, which means when they use their arms and leg muscles to run, they can't actively breathe, which is kind of wild. Some organisms get around this. My geckos get around this by having specialized muscles to be able to buccal pump with muscles in the bottom of their mouth and throat. Kind of like sharks that can buccal pump. Kind of wild. You're not getting tested on box lungs and buccal pumping. But pretty cool. Like birds, mammals have a big brain. So mammals tend to have a well-developed brain. And like birds, mammals exhibit a lot of prenatal care. And parental care. Prenatal, parental. Gotta love it. Prenatal is before you're born. Mammals do exhibit prenatal care. It's called not dying while you're pregnant. Mammals exhibit a lot of parental care, significantly more than a lot of non-archosaur reptiles. So, pretty cool. We've got a lot of stuff here. So, let's talk about the clade that separates mammals out from the rest of them. So, you know what? I will just throw up a slide here because I can very quickly just have a line here. And this is the amniotes. Amniotes includes reptiles, dinosaurs, what have you, and also mammals. What we're going to do is we are going to create our divergent spot here. All right. And this is going to be the reptiles. And over here we have the synapsids. Synapsids got a few interesting features that separate them out from the rest of reptilia. When you're drawing a dinosaur, you have your eye cavity, and then you have a couple of, so here's my dinosaur eye cavity, and then I have a hole, and then I have another hole for a nostril. So boop boop. This would be a diapsid skull. If I'm drawing a mammal, like a, I don't know, dog skull or something, I have, you know, the eye socket there, and then I have a nostril. Sweet dog skull, I promise. Okay, so now it just looks like a dinosaur. Whatever. But the thing is, this is a synapsid skull, and it kind of, there's a lot going on here, but one of the big things is a hole for the nostrils and another hole there, and then over here just a hole for the nostrils. So another big deal that separates synapsids from the reptilians is heterodont dentition. Diapsids have homodont dentition. What does that mean? Heterodont dentition, different teeth. Homodont dentition, same teeth. And it gets real deep on different versus same. So for one, if you look inside the mouth of any modern mammal, there's a bunch of different kinds of teeth. There's incisors, there's canines, there's premolars, there's molars. They all have different shapes. They all have different functions, right? When you look into a lot of homodont dentition, you have the tooth, and that tooth is kind of the same, no matter what side you're looking at. Even like, so all the teeth are identical. And, you know, say this is the inside of the jaw here. And the shape of the teeth here is going to be the same versus if you're looking at it from the outside of the jaw. So this is the outside view, and this is the inside view. And the teeth are shaped the same, right? Even in like sauropods, whose teeth are modified to help like cut leaves and stuff, they're still the same basic shape. If you look at like your canines alone, they have a rounded outer part, and then they kind of flatten in here. And it can get even more complicated than that. Let me, so this heterodont homodont is really the biggest single thing I can point to here. Knowing synapsid diapsid skulls apart is all right, but if I'm asking like a short answer question, so anyway, if I'm asking a short answer question, saying two holes versus like a nostril and a bonus hole versus just a nostril, I mean, technically correct, but I'm going to be real happy if I see heterodont and homodont dentition. So, yeah. I think the most I might do with a question about skulls is if I were going to include the skull at all, I'd have a picture of a dinosaur skull and like a picture of a mammal skull, like an A and a B, and you'd have to select the synapsid. I don't think I'd make you draw or describe the skulls, but heterodont, homodont, ooh, I like that. Okay, anyway, I am needing to move forward. So on we go. Let's look at the first synapsids. And you know what? The first synapsids aren't going to look an awful lot different from a lot of the reptiles. So, dimetrodons belong to a group of synapsids called the edaphosaurs. And the big deal here is that they have synapsid skulls and they have heterodont dentition. Now, if you look at a dimetrodon skull, it's not going to look an awful lot like heterodont dentition. In this later synapsid here, we have a gorgonopsid, Inostransevia. You can actually see a little bit. I have no idea if Zoom works now. You can see a little bit here that there's some pretty distinct differences between their enlarged canines and their other teeth. So they have much clearer heterodont dentition, but there's also like 50 million years of difference between these. The edaphosaurs, the dimetrodons, they are some of the most basal synapsids. And if you want to see heterodont dentition in them, by the way, synapsid is a term. We used to use the term mammal-like reptile, but they're actually significantly more related to mammals than they are to any given reptile. So, we generally now use the term proto-mammal. I'm, 43. I'm 43, so occasionally I'm going to drop mammal-like reptile. It kind of sounds more dramatic, like reptile, but mammal-like. Anyway, so the proto-mammals, the OG synapsids, and I promised you heterodont dentition. Here it is. This is the outside view of a synapsid teeth, and then this is the inside view of the synapsid of this synapsid tooth. So this is a dimetrodont. And the biggest evidence here of heterodont dentition are these little features of the tooth geography. So under electron scanning microscope, they found that it had these very distinct markings on there on one side, and then on the other side we have very distinct and different tooth markings. So it's not nearly as dramatic as it is in like gorgonopsids or more modern mammals, but here we have different teeth, because differences on the outside versus the inside is still heterodont. So that's pretty cool. So here is a good old synodont mammal. And this is down in like the Triassic around 200 million years ago. Now, by this point, we're seeing evidence of hair because we see evidence of whiskers. We have no real evidence. We don't know when hair evolved in the synapsids, in the basal synapsids. Whiskers are like our biggest deal here. Also, coprolites, fossil poop with hair in it. Those are where we know, yes, there's hair now. Hair does not particularly fossilize very well. But there's features on the bone that indicate whiskers are present. And like parts of the, you know what, it's too much detail to talk about what hallmarks of a skull indicate that you have a sensory structure connected there. But features on the skull indicate that there were whiskers, which is pretty cool. So, roughly 200 million years ago, in the Mesozoic, keep throwing these geological eras at you: Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. That's the Mesozoic. So about 200 million years ago, right smack dab in the Triassic, we have the appearance of anatomically modern mammals. There are a few things going on here. We know, based on the fact that they have fossils of adult mammals and young mammals, that the features of the young are not well developed enough to indicate that they developed completely in an egg. And so that indicates that by this time we're doing live birth of a sort, and we're also secreting milk. So they appeared in the Mesozoic. Mammals weren't particularly numerous during the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous, on account of there being much more successful organisms. The non-avian and avian dinosaurs were doing a pretty good job of occupying major niches during this time. So the Mesozoic was dominated by dinosaurs. Mammals present, but relatively small. Largest fossils we tend to find are about a meter long, 3.3 feet. So, yeah, likely specialized, like fossils that we find often have enlarged eye sockets. So they're specialized for low light conditions, nocturnal natures, that sort of thing. They were probably all over the place. However, sometime around 55 to 50 million years ago, mammals underwent drastic adaptive radiation. And why 50 to 55 million years ago did mammals undergo drastic adaptive radiation? There were kind of a couple of niches open. So, roughly 66 to 65 million years ago, you have the extinction event. So the KT event that results in the Cretaceous extinction. Dinosaurs are pretty much all dead, but non-avian dinosaurs are dead by about 64 million years ago. A million years past, the sun getting snuffed out isn't so bad. By that, I mean that the meteor hit the Yucatan Peninsula and ejected so much material into the sky that it would have darkened significantly. It also triggered unstableness in the mantle and the crust, and so there was a ton of volcanic activity all over the world, spewing noxious gases, and also darkening the sky. Like, one eruption of a volcano, Krakatoa, caused a global cooling period that lasted like 50 years or something. Look up the Little Ice Age if you want to learn about that. I think it was Krakatoa, but I could be wrong. Anyway, all that ejecta in the atmosphere kind of drastically reduced the availability of sunlight, which reduced the availability of plant life, which reduced the availability of food, and had that cascading effect. And it wasn't until around 55 to 50 million years ago that the ecology of the Earth was at a state where you could see a bunch of dramatic adaptive radiation. And mammals sure took advantage of that. So, we have this massive increase in diversity after the dinosaurs go extinct. Make sure I am on track. So, hair. Now, I thought I would take a second, non-tested thing here, and talk about hair and mammary glands real quick with relation to amniotes in general. Remember that the extant amniotes are reptiles, avian dinosaurs, and mammals. And the cool thing here that I wanted to briefly mention is the placoderm. This is a feature visible during embryonic development, and basically you just look at the epithelial tissue, right? So the outer layers of tissue, ectoderm, and you see this little thickening of tissue. That little thickening during embryonic development is a placoderm. And it can do a number of things. One, it will recess a little bit, right? And it can produce glands in the skin. In birds, the placoderm will produce the most rudimentary feather tufts down, and feathers get more advanced from there. And then only recently discovered in reptiles, because one of the things we've noticed about reptiles is that they didn't have these placoderms. But in reptiles, placoderms actually have been found. and they've been found only during embryonic development, and they are not nearly as dense in reptiles as they are in mammals and dinosaurs. So that's kind of cool. So you get little bitty placoderms on these reptiles, and then as embryonic development occurs, scales grow out. It's not like a flower of scales, but you get the idea. There are some placoderms, and they do appear where scales grow. The other cool thing to bring up about placoderms, right? They produce, a hair follicle, sure. But the placoderms that produce hair follicles and the glands that secrete sweat and oil, right? Those placoderms in other parts of the mammal migrate deeper into the tissue. They kind of invade the mesoderm a little. And they become milk glands. So the genes that produce milk glands, hairs, feathers, and indeed scales are part of the same family of genes, indicating that common evolutionary origin. So the original amniotes had some kind of placoderm, and diversity in placoderms generated all these diverse groups, which is pretty cool. So, the especially cool part being that we have common genes, the same genes, the same gene families trigger the development of scales and the little glands that secrete oil during a shed, and the glands that produce hair follicles and secrete sweat or oil onto the skin, and the glands that produce milk, and the structures that produce feathers, right? In fact, the placoderm that produces down goes through a stage where it kind of looks an awful lot like a scale. So this embryonic state shows this beautiful evolutionary tree of that expanding diversity from the amniotes, where you had the mammals, the diapsids, and you have the lepidosaurs and archosaurs. And, tuataras and turtles. So that's pretty neat. Just this placoderm stuff shows us that we're not all that different. Okay, so hair serves a number of important functions, right? Insulation is kind of the big obvious one. A big thick coat of fur keeps you warm. Sea otters don't go into hypothermia in the cold waters off of California because they have extremely dense fur, like some of the densest fur on the planet. Camouflage. Tigers have awesome camouflage. Lots of animals have camouflage. Hair is a big deal. Cryptic coloration is camouflage. Sensory. What did I just mention in those first mammals that we saw evidence of? Was it whiskers? It was whiskers. Whiskers can sense like vibrations. So you might have whiskers trailing on the ground, and you might have whiskers in the air, and yeah. Hairs can serve defensive purposes. The quill of a porcupine is a modified hair. So that's pretty cool. And finally, hairs are novel structures. They are a synapomorphy of the mammals, a derived characteristic one of the things that we use to define a mammal as separate from the other amniotes. So, pretty cool. They're not like feathers. They're not like scales. They are hair. Okay. Next up, hey, I was talking about placoderms and hairs and also mammary glands. I circled mammals and I circle mammary glands. So mammary glands secrete milk. And they are a big deal. Milk is a obvious nutrient fluid for feeding young. Every extant mammal secretes milk. It's not all the same milk, but they all secrete milk. So that's pretty cool. Milk glands look a lot during the development of the milk gland. That placoderm turns into something that looks an awful lot like one of those watery sweat glands before it sinks. Untested thing. It's thought that the milk is sort of a secondary function, that the original function of those glands that would become mammary glands was to secrete a fluidic solution that would help keep eggs from desiccating. So you'd curl around the eggs, hold them against your belly where those glands secrete their fluid, and it helps keep eggs from desiccating. So unfortunately, we have no basal synapsid eggs. There's just none of them. Could potentially be like partial evidence, one of the hypotheses for why there are no synapsid eggs, even though we are very sure they laid them, is because the thought was if you need to secrete a fluid to keep them from drying out, then they must be papery thin shells. And then those wouldn't fossilize. But we have no fossil eggs. So we have cool hypotheses about it. We know that they're derived from some kind of sweat gland-like structure. Okay. Back on to important stuff. As I mentioned, all mammals are endothermic. They have that very efficient cardiovascular system that supplies heat to their body. They can maintain body heat outside of environmental effects. They have a 4-chambered heart. And they have a diaphragm for them lungs. Diaphragms, also not unique to mammals. I spent a bunch of time talking about how my geckos don't have them. But guess what does? Extant dinosaurs. Kind of makes sense to converge on that kind of muscular solution. A diaphragm is an extremely effective respiratory muscle. So that's pretty cool. Heterodont teeth. I already did this. I already did it. So that's pretty cool. This mandible here is the gray fox mandible. The gray fox being my example because it is exceedingly adorable. But you can see we have really great view of the specializations of the different teeth. Canine, incisors, premolars, molars. Right? That's kind of the basic mammal jaw setup. Incisors, canine, premolars, molars. Varies based on shape, varies based on niche. But yeah, That's pretty cool. Compare it to our archosaur here, our crocodilian, and you can see these teeth are different in size based on how new the teeth are, and they are not different in features. There's not different specialized teeth, and the microscopic features or even the macroscopic features of the teeth themselves are not particularly specialized. Okay. The three lineages of mammals: monotremes, marsupials, eutherians. And let's get into it. Monotremes are the egg-laying mammals. What does that mean? That's not a question that I should ask, because it means they lay eggs, right? There are only 5 extant species of monotremes, and they are restricted to Australia and the island nation of New Guinea, which is pretty darn close to Australia, indicating a common origin. Monotremes are considered the most basal of all mammals, right? Duck-billed platypus, obviously the most famous of the monotremes. It looks fake. Even when you see a real one, you don't really think it's a real one. They have a bunch of weird, unique features that you're not going to have to list, but they have electrical sensing. They can sense electrical fields over in their bill, and that helps them forage because their eyes and nostrils are shut while foraging, right? In addition, they have on their rear ankles, the males have venom spurs, and they are legit venomous. So, fun fact about that, still in untested info. The genes that control venom production, basically the genes that allow them to be venomous, are homologs of the genes that allow reptiles to be venomous. Now, this is not a common evolutionary origin. This is a convergent thing. But once again, kind of cool that it's a convergent evolutionary solution in the same genes. So that's pretty sweet. So duck-billed platypi are wild. But let's talk about laying eggs. One, eggs last a very short period of time. Like, we're talking 1 month or less for egg gestation, right? So they lay the egg in a special pouch. So it's stored in a pouch in echidnas, a little egg pouch. Or in platypi, they build a nest. They have an egg nest. So that's kind of cool. The pouch in the echidnas for storing that egg is not at all the same as the pouch in a marsupial, right? The pouch in a marsupial is the site of lactation. There is a nipple in that pouch, and it's the site of most of the physiological development of the offspring. Here, it's a pouch that the egg sits in. All right. They lay their egg through a cloaca. Monotremes are the only mammals with a cloaca. Other mammals have openings for their genital tracts. Their reproductive tracts have their own openings separate from their intestinal, their GI tract, right? So, we still have the all-purpose hole in monotremes. So monotremes are considered most closely related to the OG mammals. So they're our most basal mammal. And they have certain features that are more reptilian. So basically, I'll have a picture in a second of the shoulder and pelvis. Are reptile-like. So let's look at what it means to have a reptile-like shoulder and pelvis. So this is the shoulder girdle. Here's the scapula. There's no distinct clavicle. It's all part of one sort of large bone, and the sternum comes off here. And if you look at the side, scapula, right? And there's, our large connected bone there. And then if you look at our monotreme, it looks a lot more like our reptile. I may have just said that this was the reptile and this was the monotreme, which of course is wrong, but not all that wrong. As it turns out, easy mistake to make if I am not paying attention. So you can see, especially here in this clavicle. Now, are you going to be shown a picture and say, is this a marsupial clavicle, a mammal clavicle? Is this a reptile or a monotreme clavicle? No. But as far as skeletal anatomy goes, being able to know that the shoulder and the pelvis of our monotremes is significantly more reptile-like is the idea there. So eggs, cloacas, and shoulder and pelvis. Those are our monotreme features that are significantly more reptile-like than mammal-like. So probably more related to the synapsid history of the mammals. So that's pretty cool. Okay, I dropped my little thing. Oscar, where is it? There it is. Ta-da! I don't need to cut anything. On to marsupials. Marsupials are the pouched mammals. That is a clade of organisms that exist almost entirely in Australia. So, almost entirely in Australia. This is because when you have placental mammals and marsupial mammals in the same area competing for the same niches, the placentals tend to win. So basically, marsupial mammals get pushed into extreme little niches. The first marsupials were, once you get from monotremes, you have your division in Mammalia, and you have monotremes, the basal mammals. Then you have the split that produces, let's make this less of a cladogram anyway, here we go. There's marsupials and there's placentals, So, marsupials were the first mammals that did internal development, no egg. First marsupials were very small. Non-tested, even though I think it's super duper cool. right here is Monito del Monte, which doesn't sound particularly Australian. It's the little monkey of the mountains. And it is a teeny tiny little marsupial. And it is part of a nearly extinct clade, Microbiotheria. Indeed, it is the only Microbiotherian, but it is a basal marsupial. So why would this basal marsupial be in South America? Could it be that once upon a time the continental plate that contained Australia and the continental plate that contained South America had those land masses connected? And so our little microbiotherians evolved in South America, and they radiated outward and they migrated, and a bunch of them made it to Australia, and then Australia disconnected, and then the placental mammals evolved and wiped out nearly all the marsupials. And because Australia was disconnected, the marsupials survived. But marsupials did not evolve in South America. South America is the marsupial lifeboat. It's not to say there's no successful marsupials outside of South America. After all, the Monito del Monte is there, and it is successful in being incredibly adorable. Also, the opossum. Good old opossums. This is our only marsupial species in North America and South America left. So the opossum is a marsupial. It has a pouch. It is also cute in its own way. So very important to the ecosystem. Managed to find a niche and be successful enough that its species continues despite the abundance of placental mammals. So what makes marsupials so different from the other mammals, right? So one, we're different from monotremes because, well, A, we have a vulva. So we have an external genital opening, and we have a separate gastrointestinal opening. So no cloaca, right? B, we don't lay an egg. We have a very reduced uterus, a very small, reduced structure. There's actually still a yolk present during embryonic development. So during development in the uterus, there's still a yolk. So that's kind of cool. But we have internal development. That's different from monotremes. No egg, thank you. We also, in addition to the yolk, see the placenta and the chorion form around them. So the placenta, you have your embryo, and then you have your placenta, and it's filled with fluid. And so you have gas exchange occurring in there. You have various other things going on. The chorion is a waste exchange thing. So you have a very reduced placenta. So we have a highly reduced yolk. And a highly reduced placenta. Now, highly reduced, that's language you often use when talking about evolutionary change over time as we go through, and that would imply the placenta was present in a larger or more complicated state and then reduced. So let me correct myself. Rather than a highly reduced placenta, we have an extremely primitive placenta. We still have the chorion, so we have some egg-like, external egg-like features. And we have some more internal development style features. Now, while we have internal development, it is a very brief internal development. Kangaroos, this is a kangaroo right here. It doesn't look an awful lot like a kangaroo. I wasn't able to write kangaroo there. It looks like a picture of a fetus, but this is indeed a kangaroo that has been born. For kangaroos, they're born at 8 days old. So the embryo exits the vulva at 8 days. It has extremely small back legs. They're little more than bones in a limb bud. It has front legs that have enough paw and claw to be able to grip onto skin and hair. And it has to crawl from the vulva and the vaginal opening to the pouch. It will then crawl into the pouch, latch on to a nipple in the pouch, have a little bit of skin fuse over that, and development will continue externally in the pouch. So, complicated. But hey, no egg. We're kind of an intermediate between our monotremes and our placental mammals. So, pretty cool. These evolved around 100 million years ago. Obviously, before the placental mammals. Eutherian means placental. There's a lot of convergent evolution. Because there's no placental mammals in Australia and New Guinea, where we find our marsupial mammals, there's a lot of convergence in morphology, body morphology, for occupying similar niches where marsupial mammals are dominant versus where eutherian placental mammals are dominant. So let's look at some skulls. So this is obviously your wolf. So timber wolf, Arctic wolf, I'm not sure, but it's a wolf. And if we look at the skull of the wolf, and over here we have the thylacine called the Tasmanian tiger. This is a marsupial. And we're going to see some similar morphology here in muscle or in teeth shape. So we can see that they are going to be carnivores, right? So they are well adapted for a life of carnivory. They have teeth very well adapted for that. Wolves work together to take out large prey. Even a single wolf can take out like a sheep. When you look at the actual anatomy of a thylacine skull, the way their mouths could open, you look at the joint and their jaw can open like much, much wider than a wolf. Like a wolf can go like this, and a thylacine can go like this. And because they have a much greater hinged capacity, there's much less like crushing, holding muscle capacity there. So thylacines likely ran down rabbit-sized prey. However, through the magic of similar body morphology, European colonists thought that thylacines would eat all their sheep, so they hunted them to extinction. Yay. All right, more convergent evolution. Over here on the left, we've got our marsupials. On the right, we've got our placentals. And here's two organisms, the deer mouse and the plantigale, occupying similar niches, having similar morphologies. The marsupial mole and the mole, a sugar glider, a flying squirrel. You get the idea. These occupy similar niches, so similar adaptations are helpful, and bam, we have similar morphology. So, pretty cool. And now on to the eutherian mammals, the placentals. Okay, so important things. A yolk sac that is virtually useless. I would be hesitant to declare it, but it's likely completely functionless, but we can see it's still present. Instead, we have a very well-developed placenta. Basically, a placenta is specialized tissue that has a ton of capillaries. So there's my placental tissue, and then we'll have my uterine tissue. At a certain stage of development, the embryo produces this placenta that has like these amoeboid-like extensions. And the placenta will invade the uterine lining. The placenta and the uterus, the uterine lining, have very rich capillary supplies. So here's some blood vessels in the uterine lining. And then we'll have some blood vessels in the placenta. And they are very close together. Close enough together that essentially diffusion. So gas, nutrients, and waste diffuse back and forth across the placenta. The blood vessels never connect. They just get real close. Close enough that diffusion takes care of our gas and nutrient and waste exchange. The placenta is derived from the chorion and the allantois, allantois. So, as I said, food, gas exchange, waste exchange. Obviously, water exchange as well. We have a really well-developed fluid inside, so yeah, it's pretty darn cool. Okay, so the placenta is derived from the chorion and allantois. So here we go. This is, if you couldn't guess, a reptile egg. This right here is a monotreme egg. This is an embryonic marsupial. And this is our embryonic eutherian, placental. And you can see the reduction of the yolk sac. Gets smaller until it's at this stage of being almost useless, right? You can see the extremely well-developed placenta with all those amoeba-like extensions implanting it into the uterine lining, which is pretty cool. All right. Pretty cool. 17 out of the 19 orders of mammals. So you have Mammalia, and you have, this is class King Philip came over. So then you have order, and there's the monotremes, the marsupials, and the eutherians, the placentals. There are 19 orders. There are exactly 1 monotreme orders, 1 marsupial orders, 17 eutherian orders. So, as I said, marsupials only thrive where there were never any placentals. All right. Since we're moving forward into larger and larger looks at the ecology of the world, let's talk about a particularly successful clade, the primates. So, what are the characteristics of a primate that separate it from the other orders of eutherian mammals? A grasping hand. So grasping fingers and toes. Not so much toes in hominins, a little bit, but a lot of primates have really effective grasping digits on their toes. No claws. Instead, we have nails. So fingernails instead of claws, and toenails. These serve to protect sensitive tissue beneath. These digits are extremely sensitive for touch information. In many primates, not in all, but in many, the first digit is opposable. Why am I saying first digit instead of opposable thumb? Because that's opposable thumb is a very human thing to say. If you're an orangutan, your thumb and your big toe are plenty opposable. So many have an opposable first digit, whether that's the thumb or the big toe. Hard to call it a big toe when it's kind of a whole hand on an orangutan. Other features of primates. They all have binocular vision. What is binocular vision good for? All right. You have an eyeball. You have an eyeball. Each eyeball has its own field of view. And where they overlap, you have the ability to perceive depth. So they have excellent depth perception. That overlapping area is stereoscopic vision. So binocular vision means we have overlap in fields of view. So that is our stereoscopic vision, the overlap. And that's where all our depth perception comes from. That's why if you cover one of your eyes, you get a reduced ability to detect depth, right? I'm not quite sure where my hand is in relation to the laptop screen unless I take that off and my hand off my eye, and then I have much better depth perception because overlap. Only primates have both grasping digits that have fingernails instead of claws and opposable digits, and stereoscopic vision with depth perception. So, having both of these together is what allows a primate to be a primate. Some other orders of mammals have grasping digits and opposable digits, but not binocular vision. You get the idea. All right, 3 main living groups of primates. Lemurs, lorises, and bush babies belong to one lineage. Then we have the tarsiers, and finally the anthropoids, monkeys and apes. So, what kind of lobe-finned fish is a lemur? Lemurs, lorises, and bush babies are mostly, almost all are arboreal, right, in the trees. Most are nocturnal. They tend to be small to medium-sized. Lorises are pretty much all very small critters, and the lorises are very well adapted for nocturnal life. This right here is a slow loris. This slow loris has eyes that are extremely large so that they can see quite well at night. How large are they? There's no room in that eye socket for the muscles that move the eyes back and forth and up and down. When a loris needs to look to the side, a loris does this. A loris's eyes are locked forward. Its eyes got so large to give it such good night vision, there's not room for the muscles that allow the eyes to move in the orbit. Kind of hilarious. Not too bad. All the lemurs are in Africa. Lorises can be found in South Asia. Too much detail. Mostly lemurs, lorises, and bush babies are arboreal and nocturnal, small to medium. These are a more basal primate. All right. Tarsiers are more closely related to monkeys and apes than they are to lemurs. So, tarsiers closer to anthropoids. And then anthropoids, monkeys, and apes, then that includes humans. This kind of lobe-finned fish appeared around 50 million years ago. So this division point between tarsiers and anthropoids. Let's clear this off. That's not it. Where is clear screen? Oh, well. Oh, it's over here. Okay, so this is about 50 million years ago. Then we have our New World monkeys and our Old World monkeys. Tails on Old World, no tails No, wait, I have that reversed. Plus, you're not about to get tested on tail versus no tail. In fact, you're not going to get tested on New World versus Old World traits. But they diverged about 35 million years ago. Then we have the apes diverging about 20 million years ago, and around 7 million years ago, you get the hominids. So, not too bad. So primates appeared a little more than 50 million years ago. Pretty cool. We're not too concerned about lemurs, lorises, and bush babies, or the tarsiers. In fact, how not concerned are we about it? This one I'm circling here, this is the slow loris. And this one over here that I'm circling is the tarsier. Now, I was correct about all those eye facts for the animal that I was pointing to. I just called it a loris. And I should have called it the tarsier. Tarsiers can't move their eyes in their orbit. So, it's kind of cool. Yeah. If you ever see any YouTube videos with some of these as pets, they were illegally harvested in the trade. They tend to have a really sharp tooth, like their front teeth tend to be very sharp, especially the tarsiers and the slow lorises. They have kind of a sweat gland that produces an irritant, like an irritant oil, and they'll like get that irritant oil on their teeth so that they can deliver an irritating bite to something. Generally what happens is those two teeth get ripped out and then they get thrown in a crate, and then if they don't bleed to death, they get sold as a pet. So I have now poisoned at least one of your enjoyable YouTube activities. On to the hominins. Nothing ruins something like a hominid. All right. Apes and hominids diverged from the other primates around 20 million years ago. Hominids appeared around 6.5 million years ago. What are the hominid characteristics? Bipedal. 2 legs. 2 feet, 2 legs, right? So we stand up. So, this requires changes in limb anatomy, right? So for one, in order to stand, in most primates, this is an awesome drawing, but that first toe points to the side and is opposable. In humans, in order to bear our weight, that toe points forward, and it is no longer opposable. Although I oppose my big toe when I bash it into something. I oppose you. I'm late. It's tired. Okay, so the big toe points forward, not to the side. Our limbs have to change. We now have much longer forelimbs compared to the other primates. Forelimbs longer than the other apes. The other lobe-finned fish. We have a backbone that is kind of jerry-rigged from a quadruped backbone. And so it has some distinct curves in it to help distribute weight on an organism that stands up. So you have 2 distinct curves, right? Curve number 1 curve number 2. And these curves help to distribute mass against the force of gravity. So they help us keep a center of mass for walking upright. In addition, when you look at anything that has a vertebral column, where the neck connects up to the skull, there is a large hole. If you want to be all Latin-y about it, you'd say it's a big hole in a bone. And a big hole in a bone gets to be called a foramen. That's a hole in a bone. Magnum. Big. This is the foramen magnum, and it is at the bottom of the skull. That is a huge deal, right? When you look at a ape, like a gorilla or a chimp, the foramen magnum is at the back of the skull, not the bottom of the skull. So, pretty wild. Then we have big changes to the pelvis. We have a broader pelvis. Again, help distribute weight, and also attach larger muscles. Your legs are going to be longer. I'll even put back legs, aft limbs, forelimbs and aft limbs. Longer back legs that need much larger muscles because, again, in apes, a lot of your body weight is going to go into your arms when you're moving around. Whereas in hominids, that goes into the legs. Then tool use. Complex tool use is a hominin characteristic. Language, artistic symbolism, these are all very common in hominins, not unique to hominins. So, tools, art, complex language. They are present in all extant hominid species, where we find large populations of hominins in the fossil record. We often find evidence of tool use, art to differing degrees, symbolism in that art. So, pretty cool. Yeah. There are various animals that have access to tools. Crows. The New Caledonian crow makes tools. Art. Honestly, if you show an animal how to use paintbrushes, a lot of them will voluntarily use paintbrushes. Complex languages. Dolphins. There's a lot of evidence that dolphins have syntax in their calls to each other. They have unique calls associated with each individual dolphin, so that's pretty cool. So, these are not unique features. Hominins are not some kind of super special boy. Like, I think what makes us, sets us apart from all the other animals is that we're able to screw everything up on a much grander scale. Anyway, there's only one extant hominin, and that's Homo sapiens. So, there have been a lot of them. This is a chart over evolutionary history. If you look at like a line of hominins, you can see that at some point it is entirely possible that Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, and Homo sapiens could interact. 3 different species of hominins interacting. That would have been wild. There's evidence of interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. There's a hypothetical. This is the interbreeding stuff that's not tested. The fact that they all 3 may have lived at the same time, that's not tested. Really, the only thing on this slide is that Homo sapiens are the only extant ones. But I think it's very cool that all 3 may have existed at the same time. There's some pretty good evidence that humans interbred with Neanderthals, especially in European descended human populations. There's a hypothetical unidentified hominin species we refer to as the Denisovans. And it looks like there's evidence that if we can find fossils that prove Denisovans were a unique species and not one of the other hominins already discovered, it kind of looks like there was interbreeding between Homo sapiens and the Denisovans. So I can at least answer one question of what it would have been like if all 3 hominins were interacting at the same time. All right, let's move on to ecology. All right. Boo, boo, boo. Let's get to a grander scale. And let's talk about what ecology is. Ecology is from the Greek oikos, which is home, and logos, which is knowledge or study. Am I going to ask you some Greek prefix and suffix? No. But this is practically required when we're doing introductions to stuff. I have to tell you the Latin derivatives of the name of the field of study. So there you go. I did it. What is ecology? Ecology is the study of interactions. Right? It's the study of interactions between animals, it's the study of interactions not just between animals, but between, let's just say, organisms in general. I'm a very animal biased person, unfortunately. I love animals. So between organisms, so plants and plants, animals and plants, bacteria and animals, viruses and what have you, interactions between organisms, and also between organisms and their environment. So what is an environment? When we refer to an environment, in general, we're referring to biotic factors, the things that live in a place. So the living things in an area. And the abiotic. Amazingly enough, A for without, the non-living things in an area. So temperature, right? Soil, although soil has a biotic component, but without writing it all down, the size of the chunks of rocks in the soil, that would be the abiotic portion of soil. Is it dirt? Is it silt? Is it gravel? Right? So temperature, soil, sunlight available, availability, water availability, that sort of stuff. So we talk about the environment. It's both the biotic and the abiotic factors in a given area. Ecological studies, when we're talking about an environment, we can talk about different organizational levels, just how clades are nested categories for classifying organisms. We have nested categories for different levels of ecological study. So there's the entire whole ass globe. Oop, I cussed. Oh well. Then you can separate that down into landscapes. Landscapes include multiple different plant communities and like water availability and that stuff. So you have land, you have water, you could have rivers running through a landscape. Ecosystem ecologies. Ecosystem ecologies are much more focused in a given area, right? So I might have the landscape. Here, let's not draw a box. I might have the Rocky Mountains. And that would be a landscape. And then I could look in the Rocky Mountains and I could find a little valley. And in that valley, I have like a stream, I have grasslands, I have stuff like that. That is the ecosystem, the local ecosystem. And then I look a little bit further and I look at the community. The community is all the living species in a given area. So an ecosystem is abiotic and biotic. A community is all the biotic things in the ecosystem. So the deer, the elk in this valley, the wolves in the valley, the wolverines, the badgers, right? All the little different living things. The soil bacterium, the grasses, the trees, the biotic things. That's the community. Then a population is a single species in that given area. So all the elk in that valley, and then organismal ecology. That one. I want to look at that elk and how that elk is interacting. So, the driving force of differences in ecology, right? The driving force. You know what? I'm going to do this button. Is the climate. The climate determines the ecology of the area, right? Again, sun availability, temperature, all of this stuff, all of those abiotic factors, like especially temperature, wind, sunlight availability, water availability, all those are major features of climate, right? Climate is generally considered the long-term weather conditions. I'm going to put weather in quotes. Because when you think about weather, you think about how cold it is and how much light there is and whether there's precipitation, right? Weather is a snapshot. weather is what it is now. Climate is the average over 50 years. That's just a throw out. It's not defined as an average over 50 years, but it's the average over long periods of time. So, weather changes frequently throughout the year. Climate is an average of things like the amount of light in an area, the average temperature range of an area, the average water availability in that area. Desert conditions is a climate. Hot and dry is the weather. You get the idea. So the climate is what determines the ecology of an area. And we can look at patterns in climate at different levels themselves. So there's macroclimates, which is generally what you think of when you hear the term climate. So global patterns. And then there's microclimate. Microclimate is a nested term. So it could be under a log, right? Colorado, not exactly a particularly humid place. Like the air outside hovers around like 30 to 40% humidity. Sometimes we're called a high plains desert. But you lift up a log in a forest and you're going to have extremely hot humidity. So under the log is the microclimate. The average humidity of the air in Colorado is more a consequence of the macroclimate. Not bad. Continuing along. I'm going to do a real quick check to see if my camera battery is still good. I'm back. I don't know how long ago I was gone. Let's get this show back on the road. There's a few more slides to go. Macroclimate. Honestly, just mentioned this. This is the global climate patterns. So, this affects the biosphere. What is the biosphere? It's the whole darn planet. So, it's the abiotic and biotic factors of the planet. And all living things on it. So, all living communities on Earth are affected by macroclimate. What is the macroclimate influenced by? Primarily, the difference in the amount of sun parts of the planet get. So, differences in solar radiation, sunlight exposure. And essentially, it has to do with the amount of energy and light we're getting from the sun, right? So, basically, if you think of the amount of energy coming off the sun gives off energy at a relatively constant rate, right? So here's my, I don't know, let's just say it's 100 energy units, because why not? And that's what's coming out of the sun, right? And then we have this part of the planet here that's more in line with the sun. The angle at which the light hits the Earth affects how much sunlight it gets. The same amount of sunlight is more concentrated the more parallel the Earth is to the sun. So Here's my pole. Here's my Earth. That's 23.5 degrees because the Earth is tilted. Here's my sun. There's my equator. And boom, lots of light here. And then it's very concentrated. When you get further from the equator, the same amount of sunlight spreads out over a larger area. So if I have 100 sun energy units and it's hitting along the equator where we're more focused, let's just pretend it's 10 square miles, right? Oh, then I'd take 100 energy units and I'd divide by 10, and I would get 10 sun energies per square mile. But up here, because of the angle that it hits at, the sun is more spread out. That same 100 energy units is now spread out over 50 square miles. And so now it's 2 sun energy units per square mile. And so this area is going to be colder. And this area is going to be warmer. And the trend is the further you get from the equator, right, the colder the average temperature becomes. So, energy divided by surface area. Along the equator, it's more concentrated. The angle is nearly parallel or close to it. And so there's a smaller surface area. So same amount of energy, more energy per unit surface area. Further we get from the equator, the more spread out that same amount of energy is, and the less any given area gets it, and so the colder we tend to get. Further from the equator in both directions, the colder it is. Not too awful, right? Okay, so warmer, colder is one of the most basic features of the macroclimate, with one of the most drastic consequences for the environment. At the 2 poles of the planet, right, your sunlight is so diffuse and so indirect that it is extremely cold. Antarctica and the Arctic Circle. So there you go. That's some really basic stuff. Not too bad. Okay, so what can this basic warmth, amount of light stuff do? Well, it can affect atmospheric circulation, right? So, what is atmospheric circulation? Atmospheric circulation is the patterns of the movement of air in the atmosphere. Air movement patterns in the atmosphere. Right? So, these movements tend to be predictable. Basically, we have intense solar radiation near the equator. Intense sun at the equator. I need to go find out if my frogs are fighting. Someone yelled. No fighting. Bad bullfrogs. No one appears to be fighting. Intense sun at the equator, right? The more hot it is, the more you have warm, moist air rising. So you have the ocean, and you have sunlight, and the earth warms, and the air warms, and my warm air rises. And then it rises into the heights of the atmosphere, where we're not getting as much reflection of energy, of sun energy from the surface. And things get cold again, and our air cools, and it returns down. Right? So, that's your basic cycle of air. Warm air, warm, moist air rises and cools. So when we have moist air rises and then cools, and you get precipitation, rain, or, humidity. And so, not too terrible. The equator tends to be very rainy, just because of the cycles of that atmospheric circulation. Lots of precipitation along the equator, because there's a lot of heat, and so a lot of warm, moist air rises. Right? So, at about 30 degrees latitude, latitude is away from equator. Latitude is equator to poles. Let's just say horizontal, just because that might help you organize it. So as you get away from the equator, you reach this interesting area, 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. What's interesting about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south is that warm, moist air is getting carried away from these locations. And so we get a lot of dry air. And so we get a lot of deserts. So along the 30 degrees latitude line, north or south, we have these dry areas with very little precipitation. And you get deserts. Atmospheric circulation causes oceanic circulation, and we get these important ocean currents, right? So atmospheric circulation establishes wind, and global wind patterns help establish ocean currents. So ocean currents, well, that arrow's almost to ocean currents, driven by wind. Right? You can see that the direction of the atmospheric circulation over along here on our atmospheric circulation image on the right, there's kind of an opposing direction on either side of the equator. We have coming in this way, and then we have coming in that way, right? And that means it creates global wind patterns that produce ocean currents cycling in different directions. So basically these currents cycle in opposite directions, and that creates what we call the Coriolis effect. Right? These big ocean currents, these are called gyres, Gyre. They are established by the wind, and they move in opposite directions on opposite side of the equator, driven by the wind. Coriolis effect means gyres go in opposite directions on opposite sides of the equator. That's a lot for just B. Anyway, since we are on macroclimate, the consequence of solar radiation creating these large patterns in air circulation, creating these large patterns in water circulation, means that we have moderation of temperature by the oceans. So, oceans moderate climates. Again. So, our oceans moderate temperature. So, when we're closer to an ocean, we tend to have a lower amount of seasonal variation, fewer seasonal extremes when we're closer to oceans. So that's what we mean by moderate temperature. We have fewer seasonal extremes. Continuing along in macroclimate, seasonality is created by the Earth's axial tilt, as I said, that 23.5 degree tilt of the Earth, and the rotation or the revolutions of the Earth around the sun and the rotation of the Earth. So basically different parts of the Earth are facing the sun and getting more sunlight than at some times than others. So there you go. Seasonality is caused by the tilt of the Earth on its axis and the passage around the sun. The equinox is essentially when sunlight is focused directly onto the equator. And the solstice is when the Earth is tilted most away. If this seems a little weird, you got to remember that while the sun is very large, the Earth rotates kind of on a given plane, right? So think of this on like a plate. And so the Earth is always moving around this center. And so because of that tilt, you have the equator like this, kind of at an angle, and the sunlight's coming at it. And so sometimes it's that plane has the sunlight directly hitting that equator, and sometimes that sunlight is more hitting the the tilt away. So not too terrible, I hope. So yeah, the equinox are the 2 times of the year where the days are the longest, and they're the longest because the sun is shining directly at the equator. The solstice are so basically after an equinox, days get shorter. After a solstice, days get longer. And the consequence of a solstice or an equinox largely depends on what pole, like what half of the planet you're on, north versus south. So when it's winter in North America, it's summer in Australia. Right? So seasons are kind of opposite on either sides of the equator. Anyway. I'm not a fan of that one. I don't think I'm probably going to ask you directly what the equinox and the solstice are. Anyway, continuing along. Mountains can affect macroclimate in a big way, right? So you have wind currents, right, blowing water, moist air. So say you have this water body here, and then you have maybe a South America. In fact, I'll move to the next slide because I think having a picture really helps. So let's move to the next side. This is South America. And wind coming in off South America is carrying moist air towards the Andes Mountains. And what happens is those Andes Mountains are pretty darn tall. And all that moist air gets deflected upward. And once it gets high enough, you kind of get all the precipitation effect. And we get the rain. Ooh, rain, 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 rain. And then, because we still have the driving force causing that wind to move, the atmospheric patterns, it comes down. And we have dry air. So generally when you have a mountain range, one side will be a desert and one side will be more wet. That's kind of a general thing when you have a particularly large mountain range with tall mountains, you're going to get the rain shadow effect. So a rain shadow is essentially when air traveling over a mountain dumps its moisture on one side. and dry air goes over the other. Right? So, you get some of the biggest deserts, like some of the driest deserts, where you find rain shadows. We have a windward side, which is the side where the wind is blowing in moist air. And we have a leeward side, and that's the side where it is dry. So rain shadows are a big deal. Are like particularly dry areas are created by rain shadows. This area here in the Andes, you find the Atacama Desert. It's so dry that when NASA wants to test Mars rovers in the conditions on Mars, the closest place you can get with the complete lack of moisture that you see in Mars is the Atacama Desert in the Andes. And that desert is a rain shadow desert. So that's pretty cool. Other thing about mountains is that you tend to have more sun exposure on south slopes in North America. And so one slope gets more exposure depending on what side of the equator you're on. So I'm not going to declare, like in North America, the south side gets more sun. And basically that affects the vegetation on both sides. So one side gets more sun. Erase. My brain didn't like the low space there. Gets more sun, and that affects vegetation. That's going to go hand in hand with windward, leeward rain shadows. If you're getting a lot more sun and you're on the dry side, you're going to have like this arid desert. If you're getting a lot of sun and you're on the moist side, you're going to have lush tropical vegetation. So temperature is also dramatically affected by altitude. So mountains. So basically the rule is for every 1,000 meters in elevation, the temperature goes down 6 Celsius. And that means going up 1,000 meters is the equivalent of going north or south from the equator 880 kilometers. Which is pretty dramatic when you convert. Like, going up 1,000 meters is the same thing as starting at the equator and traveling 880,000 meters away from it. So, it's a pretty dramatic effect on temperature. Yeah, the Atacama Desert. We got our windward side here. Our leeward side here. And the Atacama Desert is created by that rain shadow. Yeah. And if you've got a rain shadow and you're around that 30-degree latitude area, you're going to have some of the driest places on Earth, like the Mojave Desert in the Sierra Nevada mountains by California. So the Mojave Desert's along that 30-degree line. The Atacama might also be. Where was my slide that had the 30-degree line? Yeah. There's the Andes. So yeah, the Atacama is another one of those 30 degrees combined with a rain shadow spots. Continuing along to microclimate. So a microclimate is a very localized area. So it's a local zone. Like I said, it is nested. So what makes it different, like what allows you to define it as a microclimate, is that it's a local zone that differs from the surrounding area. The climate differs from surrounding area. So, not too terrible. A forested area, a cleared area, right? That forests create their own microclimate based on lower sun availability due to the canopy, right? There's more shade, there's less vegetation that can grow along the ground versus an open grassy area. So, like I said, under a log, you're going to get a dramatic difference in humidity from just the air. So we nest our areas. So this can result in segregation of species. So we can have species limited to small microclimates. Right? So say I am here in Colorado, and here's a big road, right? An ugly road. And we've got, you know, your dry plains along here, and your dry plains along here, and then you've got your nice fallen log. And here's a fallen log right here, creating a bunch of humidity. And here's a fallen log over here, creating a bunch of humidity. And here's a little purple roly-poly. There's my isopod there. And then I have a blue isopod over here. And guess what? Areas outside the log are too dry. The isopod has gills. It needs to breathe in very humid areas. It's restricted to the log. And so blue and purple won't be able to ever meet and interbreed. Their populations are separate because of their microclimates, their specific climatic needs, and the fact that they can't satisfy them in the area between them. So the populations are segregated, separated by their microclimate needs. They can only meet their needs in that one little microclimate spot. Again, this is climate, so this is living. When we talk about the microclimate, unlike macroclimate, microclimates are dramatically affected by living things. So macroclimates are like sunlight radiation and oceans. And then everything goes from there. Microclimates are heavily affected by both living and non-living factors. Right? If I had that log and it was on a bunch of gravel rather than soil, right? Gravel has a lot of gaps between it, and the air will dry out. The roly-polies wouldn't be able to survive in that gravel. But because there's a lot of dead, decayed plant matter and dirt and silt, I have a much more humid type of soil, right? The log itself is a product of the biotic environment. So, microclimates are determined by both the living and non-living things. Macroclimates are determined only by non-living factors. Terrestrial biomes. So what is a biome? A biome is a major ecosystem on the planet. What does that sound like? A rainforest is a biome, right? A grassland is a biome. So, they are characterized by vegetation type. Rainforest, grassland, tundras are characterized by a extreme reduction in the plant life there. They are determined by climate generally. So, the big climate things, also things like soil, which isn't entirely abiotic. So that sort of thing. Soil, by the way, can be used as shorthand for nutrient availability. Richer soil has greater nutrients. There's a whole section of ecology that is classifying soils. The amount of loam in this soil. So, organisms have adaptations to specific biomes. And you'll see a lot of convergence. Right? Australia has rainforests. The Pacific Northwest has rainforests. Cooler rainforests. Australia has some cooler rainforests. And you'll see like flying squirrels and sugar gliders. There's a lot of convergence to adapt to biomes in general, because they're determined by a type of vegetation. So a grassland in Australia will be similar to a grassland in Africa and a grassland in North America, because grasses. And grasses are predominant because of certain temperature and soils and water, and then that creates certain niches and that sort of thing. So, humans suck at maintaining biomes. Humans alter biomes a lot. We do a lot of habitat fragmentation. And we do a lot of habitat destruction. Fragmentation, right? So here's a little area, and I have a whole bunch of jaguars living in this area. And then someone says, "Hey, let's build a parking lot here, and a parking lot here, and some houses here, and we'll have a road here, and then we need a road here." And now suddenly I have a habitat where it's hard for critters, in this spot to interact with critters in this spot or this spot or this spot. This is habitat fragmentation, and then habitat destruction. Like, you would not believe the amount of wetlands humans drained to make it better to, or make it easier to settle. So, yeah. We can create climographs. Climographs are basically temperature and precipitation graphs. So we have temp versus precipitation. And it kind of is a way to show what biomes will be present in an area. Because plants rely on the amount of sunlight, which temperature is a product of the amount of sunlight, and plants rely on water. Temperature and precipitation heavily affects plant communities. I think I have a climograph around here. So this is a cool climograph. Here's the annual mean temperature on the Y, annual mean precipitation on the X, and there's certain overlapping areas. Overlap in areas tends to deal with like how consistent a factor is. So, for instance, tropical forests require consistent temperatures. And a broadleaf forest handles seasonal variations pretty good. And so this overlap here is the fact that this is an average temperature, like high plus low over the year averaged out. So this overlap here basically means where the temperature is consistently like 20 to 25 degrees throughout the year, you have tropical forest. And where it's an average of 20 to 25 degrees between seasons, like you have a hot summer and a cold winter, and they average to 20 to 25 degrees, you're going to have a broadleaf forest. So overlap is consistency versus seasonal variations. So that's kind of cool. Ecotones are present where two biomes meet. An ecotone. Whoa. It's where it's the transitional area between biomes. So, an ecotone is a transitional area where biomes are integrating, right? So, trees are getting thinner, grasses are becoming more common, right? So it's the edge of the forest is your classic ecotone, right? So the transitional space between biomes. Not too bad. Overlaps can also be affected by things like soil quality and nutrient availability and water availability, but temperature is like the big driver here, so I focused on temperature. All right, here's just a map of biomes in general, and hey, check it out. 30 degrees north, desert, 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 right? 30 degrees south, Atacama Desert, 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 desert. Oh, and in dark gray we have mountains. And look, here's a rain shadow. So even though you're, a fair ways above or below 30 degrees on here, you've still got desert because of rain shadow. Same with up here and down here, and especially true of this area up here because of the Himalayas. But yeah, you can see all of this stuff. So go ahead and memorize all of the biomes right now. Yeah, not too bad. Basically, I don't know. There's general things. Tropical forests. This is, by the way, leaving out the biomes of the ocean. So we're kind of like leaving out the richest areas on the planet. But, in general, tropical forests and temperate forests, especially rainforests in general. So let's just say rainforests. Right? These are the richest land ecosystems. When you think rainforest, you primarily think tropical forest. But there are temperate rainforests, like the Pacific Northwest, right? Washington, Oregon, that area. Those temperate, those northern forests, those are considered rainforests. Tons of precipitation, tons of life, very rich. Grasslands, you tend to get savannas and grasslands in similar temperatures. Yeah. Grasslands are generally warm with seasonal rain. Savannas are more warm. Grasslands are more seasonal rain, I suppose. I should note a savanna is kind of like a type of grassland, but restricted to very warm areas, whereas grasslands in general, very cool areas. Deserts, again, the 30-degree latitude marks. High extreme temperature variation. So extreme heat in the day, and it can be very cold at night. Right? Not too terrible. Oh. What else? Gosh, I have stuff about all of these biomes in here, but I'm not sure I want to go through every single biome and list a fun fact about them. A chaparral. Let's see, maybe I can do like one thing at a time. A chaparral. Shrubby grass, like shrubby trees. So seasonal shrubby vegetation. Shrubby is a great descriptor for a lot of the Colorado prairie, like low bushy trees, not tall big giant trees, but low bushy growth. Chaparral has a lot of like foothills and stuff. Temperate grasslands, think prairie. Savanna is kind of warm all the time and grassy with seasonal rain. Temperate grasslands are winters are present, not warm all the time, and seasonal rain. Temperate broadleaf. This is just deciduous. Think fall leaves. Northern coniferous, cold tolerant. Dominated by, amazingly enough, conifers. Who would have thought? The tundra is the coldest of all biomes. Extreme cold. Extreme cold. Right? Low biodiversity. Few plants. Extremely short growing season. Not too bad. That's a lot of stuff. Reading a climograph, I think, is important. Understanding why, climographs produce the things they do, which is, climographs tend to be very intuitive, right? The warmer it is, and the more rain there is, the more you get ecosystems that are rich, like a tropical forest. And then you have a little less precipitation, but still, warmer, and you have the temperate broadleaf forests, the fall colors. And then where it's colder, but you still have similar precipitation, you get cold tolerant species like conifers. Where it's coldest, you get tundra. And that's also very low precipitation. So low precipitation, cold tundra. Very low precipitation, hot desert. Relatively low average precipitation, but also seasonal rains. And a pretty wide variation in temperature. You get grassland. So, if you see temperate, think seasons. We're coming along. There's 4 slides left. Aquatic biomes are primarily characterized by their abiotic properties. We classified the other biomes, the land biomes, by vegetation. Now we're characterizing by abiotic properties. Marine biomes have a roughly 3% salt concentration in the water. Really doesn't sound like much, but it means an awful lot when it comes to consequences on living things. Obviously, this is the largest biome on the planet. Right? What is it? 75% of Earth's surface? Is ocean. So, the ocean affects the global climate. So, it's a climate driver. Moderates temperatures. Right? The ocean is essentially where we get rainwater from. So, like, the rain cycle, the grand majority of rainwater on the planet comes from the oceans. So, it evaporates from the oceans. I'm using ocean and marine interchangeably here. And then the primary producers, the primary photosynthetic organisms are algae and photosynthetic bacteria. Marine algae, falling into a category called phytoplankton. Critters that photosynthesize but can't move against ocean currents. So, there you go. Marine algae and photosynthetic bacteria oxygenated the planet. They oxygenate the planet to the tune of they're the major producers of O2. Also, due to the magic of photosynthesis, they're also doing the majority of CO2 removal. Basically, the ocean is where, despite the fact that there's not a whole lot of depth where photosynthesis is going on, 70 to 80% of photosynthesis is occurring in the ocean. Right? People talk big on how the rainforests produce oxygen, but that oxygen is produced through photosynthesis, and 70 to 80% of photosynthesis goes on in the marine biome. All right, the freshwater biomes. Less than 0.1 salt concentration. 2 to 3% of Earth's surface is freshwater, which is pretty amazing considering freshwater is kind of necessary for life and civilization. Freshwater comes in the form of lakes, rivers, streams, and aquifers. An aquifer is basically porous subterranean layers of substrate. So basically part of the water flow. Rain hits the ground, absorbs into the ground somewhere deep, deep below. You get these collections of water. That's why you can build a well and get water, because you tap into an aquifer. So aquifers are like one of the biggest sources for fresh water. Springs, river, like stream and river springs, are water springing out of aquifers. So anyway, yeah, fresh water, very important. All right, so that's two of the basic abiotic things. Now let's talk about more biomes associated with the oceans. Oceanic, pelagic, and benthic zones. So pelagic is open ocean. Right? It's a large amount. It's the water between the surface and the bottom. The benthic zone is the bottom. Intertidal zones, exposed and submerged by tides. That's our one thing that's worth knowing here. Estuaries. Estuaries are an ecotone, a transitional area where two biomes meet. What are those biomes? Fresh and salt water. So, an estuary is the ecotone between freshwater and saltwater. It is massive biodiversity. Indeed, a significant amount of ocean organisms have larval development in estuaries. So when we destroy estuaries, we actually have dramatic cascading effects on the ecosystem of the ocean because we're removing a place where larvae develop. Coral reefs, pretty much literally the most biodiverse places on Earth. Like, there you go. Rivers, moving fresh water. Lakes, standing fresh water. Lakes tend to be deeper and slower moving water. Wetlands are kind of a water biome that is, how do I want to put it? It's land that is inundated at times. Generally through big precipitation events. So, rain. So, the Florida Everglades are wetlands. They're more permanent wetlands. So you can have permanent wetlands like the Everglades, swamps, and you can have more temporary wetlands, which would be like floodplains, places where you have regular flooding. So wetlands do a lot of filtering. So they can filter harmful bacteria, pollution, all sorts of stuff. Wetlands also moderate floods, weirdly enough. A healthy wetland slows down floodwaters, so they're less destructive. And also, a healthy wetland has substrate that can absorb floodwaters. So, it reduces, like, the flood doesn't get as high, and it goes slower. So, a healthy wetland is amazing flood control, which makes it that much sadder that in North America, we've destroyed more than 90% of them. Okay, zones of aquatic biomes. 33 of 35, peeps. We're almost done. All right. Classification of... So, zones of biomes, the layers and what happens in them are based on the amount of light getting through the water. Light penetration. So, right off... Why don't we separate it into two based on light penetration? The photic zone, light gets through here. And the aphotic zone, no light. We already defined the pelagic zone. It's open ocean from the surface down to the bottom. We already defined the benthic zone. It's the bottom. The benthic zone is generally where we get a bunch of dead organic matter. That's the detritus along there. So there's a lot of organisms that are detritivores. Then, the abyssal zone. It's the bottom of the open ocean. Technically, a particularly deep lake can have a pelagic zone. If a lake is like large and deep, we will declare that there's a pelagic zone in it. So, I know I defined pelagic as open ocean but I guess open water would be the most technically correct, because if you have a large enough lake, you have a pelagic zone. Abyssal is 2,000 to 6,000 meters deep, so that's the bottom of the open ocean. That's the bottom of the ocean, man. Okay, this isn't so bad. So, thermoclines. Thermoclines are a product of seasonal temperature variation and light penetration. Basically, light can only go so far. So, deeper water is colder water. Shallower water is warmer water. In the summer, this is pretty much all light-based, and what you'll have is basically this warm layer and this cold layer in your stream. And it can be a pretty dramatic transitional spot. The thermocline is where you go from warm to cold. And if you're in water, like a lake or something, I encourage you to swim down a bit in the summer, because you will find the thermocline and it will be dramatic. And that's pretty cool. Winter, the thermocline is kind of reversed, because you have cold air. So you have basically ice and cold water. And when you go deep enough, you're not affected by the air. So down here, it's warmer because we're away from the air. So not too bad. So there's no thermocline in winter, because that separation is generally due to ice. But we still have stratification, layers of temperature. Now, in spring and autumn, the atmosphere starts to cause a breakdown of layers. Right? Cold air created a stratification. So the air warms, and then you get to this point where the warmer water rises. Right? The ice melts and the warm H2O up, and the cold H2O down. And there's this point where basically there's even temps. Right? There's this magical spot, essentially, because you've warmed to the point where there's no variation. The water just kind of cycles. Right? The very small variations in temperature cause this cycling. Like you're talking like 3.8 degrees and it starts to fall down and, rise up. You get the idea. Very small variations in temperature cause cycling, and we call this turnover. The bottom water to the top, and vice versa. Turnover is actually very important. It cycles nutrients. So, when autumn hits, air cools. And that top warm layer starts to reach a equal temperature with the cold layer, and again, we have turnover. So, in the winter, the water is warm at the bottom, cold on top. In the spring, the air warms and you get even temperature throughout, and it cycles. And nutrients are cycled around. In the summer, that heat and insulating effect of the water, you get heat only penetrating through the water so far, and it warms that surface water. And then you have warm on top, cold below, and then the air cools down until it's all the same temperature. And we have turnover and nutrient cycle. So that's not so bad. Last slide. Let's talk about nutrient effects in freshwater. So we can classify water into sort of two basic categories. You can have oligotrophic water and eutrophic water. Oligotrophic water tends to be clear. It has low dissolved substrates. You have high visibility. What can I say? It's clear water. As a consequence of this, one, you get a lot of light. So you get lots of algae. Also, in general, oligotrophic water is moving. Not always. Sometimes it's not in an area with like a lot of rich soil. So a mountain lake, right? There's basically rock in the bottom. So there's no soil, so it's a lower nutrient lake. But there's a lot of light, so there's algae. And because it's low nutrients, there's not a lot of critters. And since there's not a lot of critters, there's more oxygen to go around. So they tend to have high levels of oxygen. So that's oligotrophic water. A lot of moving water is oligotrophic. And so standing water, especially standing water in areas with rich substrates, so a lot of soil with organic matter in it, will produce eutrophic water. So eutrophic water tends to have really high nutrient content. So lots of dissolved minerals and fertilizer. Not necessarily human-made, but chemicals that, let's just say, minerals and nutrients. I wanted to use a different word than nutrients to be less repetitive, but whatever. Lots of dissolved minerals, lots of nutrients. Because of that, we have dense algal growth. So extremely dense algal growth to the point where we have very low visibility. Not necessarily high dissolved substrates, but low visibility. Could just be the algae. Right? If you're extremely dense in algae aren't necessarily attached to anything. You can have all those little microscopic algal protists, and you can have water that is very dense with critters. Now, low O2 because we have a lot of critters. And a lot of critters are using a lot of O2. Oligotrophic and eutrophic don't necessarily mean good and bad, right? A naturally occurring eutrophic ecosystem tends to have rich biodiversity, especially compared to an oligotrophic ecosystem where, like, there's very low biodiversity. There's lots of light, so you tend to get a bunch of algae covered rocks, but nothing like the algae content in eutrophic water. Now, the danger here is eutrophication, right? Eutrophic water isn't bad or good, it's just eutrophic. But when you have an ecosystem that isn't eutrophic and it becomes eutrophic, we call this eutrophication. And it can be very bad. So the problem with eutrophication is it is not generally the kind of slow transitional thing that a naturally occurring change in ecosystems would be. It is generally quick, and it is due to a sudden nutrient increase. We're talking sewage. We're talking fertilizer runoff. That sudden nutrient increase leads to a sudden critter explosion. Especially algae, especially protists, and that sudden critter increase leads to an oxygen crash. And then that oxygen crash leads to a lot of dead critters. Especially big ones like fish. Compared to a protist, a fish needs an awful lot of oxygen. So if algae, like sudden giant algae concentrations go up, and then the algae, these little protist and algae start using all the oxygen, and all the little micro predators of the algae suddenly explode, and they're burning through the oxygen, then suddenly there's not enough oxygen to go around, and you get a die-off of the large metabolically expensive organisms. Fish are like one of your first hallmarks. Trout are very sensitive. So eutrophic ecosystems aren't bad. They are, like a lot of the Florida wetlands, are eutrophic waters, and they're very biodiverse. Oligotrophic don't have as much biodiversity, but again, that's not bad. That's just what it is. But when you have eutrophication, that's generally a human thing. And that's Eutrophication is when you have a quick change from oligotrophic to eutrophic. And essentially, you had a oligotrophic ecosystem, and the water suddenly became eutrophic. And so all the algae blew up. All the little protists that eat the algae blew up even more. They sucked up all the oxygen, and then all the big critters die. That feels like a great time to stop. Everyone's happy. 3-hour lecture. Woo!